Missing hikers, butchered livestock left on porches as warnings, and a family bloodline the state of Missouri tried to erase from every public record it could find. The Ghent clan of Mourning Fork built a kingdom in the deepest hollows of the Ozarks, and for nearly 100 years they ran that land like it was their own private country. Sheriffs wouldn't go up there. Census takers refused the assignment. Even the federal revenue agents, the men who chased down moonshiners across 4 states, drew a hard line at the base of the mountain and said no farther. Today, the hollow is empty. The cabins are collapsed. And the official story is that the Ghents simply died out. But the people who live in the towns around Mourning Fork will tell you something very different if you catch them alone and buy them a drink. They'll tell you the Ghents didn't die. They'll tell you the Ghents were hunted. And they'll tell you what the state found in those cabins was so bad that the report was sealed for 75 years and then quietly destroyed. This is the story of the Ghent clan. And by the end of it, you're going to understand why the locals still won't say the family name out loud after dark. Before we go any further, I need you to do one thing for me. Drop a single word in the comments right now. Just one word. Tell me the name of the deepest, most isolated place near where you grew up. The kind of place your parents told you never to go alone. The kind of place kids dared each other to walk into and never did. I read every comment on these videos, and I want to see how many of you have your own version of Mourning Fork sitting in your backyard. Because every state has one. Every county has a hollow, a swamp, a stretch of woods where the rules stop applying. Drop it in the comments. One word. Let's build the map together. Now, let's go back to the beginning. And I mean the real beginning. Not the beginning the history books gave us, but the beginning the old-timers in Taney County still whisper about when the power goes out and there's nothing to do but talk. The Ghents came to the Ozarks in 1847. That's the earliest date anyone can pin down with any confidence, and even that date comes from a single land deed filed in a courthouse that burned down twice before 1900. The patriarch was a man named Elias Ghent. He came out of the Appalachian foothills of eastern Tennessee, and he brought with him a wife, 4 sons, 2 daughters, and something else. Something the local histories describe only as a considerable amount of gold. Where that gold came from, nobody could ever say. Elias never worked a paying job in Tennessee. He didn't own land there. He wasn't the son of a wealthy family. But when he arrived at the edge of what would later be called Mourning Fork, he paid cash for 1,100 acres of the most vertical, most useless-looking timberland in the entire county. The seller thought he was cheating a fool. The seller was wrong. Elias Ghent knew exactly what he was buying. The land he purchased sat on top of a natural cave system that ran for miles under the ridge. It had a spring that never froze and never dried up. It had timber so thick that a man could stand 10 feet from a cabin and not see it. And most importantly, it had exactly one way in and one way out. A single narrow trail that switched back on itself 7 times before it reached the top. You could put one man with a rifle at any of those switchbacks, and you could hold off an army. That's exactly what the Ghents did for the next 90 years. The first sign that something was wrong at Mourning Fork came in the spring of 1851. A travelling preacher named Josiah Bellamy was riding through the county on his circuit, and he stopped at a farmhouse at the base of the Ghent land to ask for water. The farmer who lived there was a man named Cletus Warren, and Cletus told the preacher a story that Bellamy wrote down in his personal journal that same night. The journal survived. It's held in a private collection in Springfield, and a researcher named Dr. Margaret Hollis was allowed to photograph it in 1998. What Cletus told the preacher was this. 3 weeks earlier, Cletus had lost a heifer, a young cow, about 18 months old, worth more money than Cletus made in a season. The cow had wandered off the pasture and gone up the ridge toward the Ghent land. Cletus knew better than to follow. Every farmer in the valley knew better than to follow anything onto Ghent land, but this was his best cow. So he waited until dawn, took his rifle, and started up the trail. He didn't make it to the first switchback. At the base of the trail, laid out neat as a Sunday dinner, was the heifer's head. Just the head. The eyes had been removed. The tongue had been removed. And someone had used a knife to carve a symbol into the forehead. Cletus described the symbol to the preacher as looking like a spider with too many legs, or maybe a hand with too many fingers. He couldn't tell which. But he understood the message. He turned around, walked back to his farmhouse, and never went up that trail again. He also stopped grazing his cattle within a mile of Ghent land. He took the loss. Every farmer in the valley took the loss. Because the alternative, whatever the alternative was worse than losing a cow. Preacher Bellamy asked around the county after that. He was a curious man, and the story haunted him. What he learned in the following weeks became the first written record of what the locals called the Ghent way. The Ghents didn't rob. They didn't rustle. They didn't come down off the mountain to cause trouble in town. But if you crossed onto their land, for any reason, you paid a price. Sometimes the price was a warning. A dead animal on your porch. A tree cut down and dropped across your driveway in the night. Sometimes the price was worse. 2 men, a father and son named Halloway, had gone up the trail in 1849 hunting deer. Neither one came back. Their bodies were found 6 months later at the base of a cliff on the far side of the ridge in a position that suggested they'd been thrown. The county sheriff at the time, a man named Buford Kane, rode up to the Ghent cabin to ask questions. He came back down 2 hours later, white as a sheet, and told his deputy the case was closed. Accidental death. Sheriff Kane resigned 3 weeks later and moved to Kansas. He never spoke about what he saw on that mountain to anyone. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to the man who took his job, but this was just the beginning. Because for the next 30 years, the Ghent clan grew. Elias and his wife had more children. Those children grew up on that mountain, married cousins from other isolated hollows, and had children of their own. By 1880, the census taker who was assigned to Mourning Fork estimated there were between 40 and 60 Ghents living on that 1,100 acres. He estimated. He didn't count, because the census taker never actually made it up the trail. He waited at the base of the ridge for 3 days, hoping someone would come down. On the 4th day, he saw 2 figures at the first switchback watching him. He couldn't tell if they were men or women. He couldn't tell how old they were. He said in his official report that they stood there, perfectly still, for over an hour, never moved, never called out, just watched. On the 5th day, the census taker went back to town, filed his estimate, and requested reassignment. His supervisor granted it without asking a single question, because by 1880, everyone in the Missouri state government who dealt with Taney County already knew the rule. You don't send men up Mourning Fork, not if you want them back. The Ghents were, by this point, running a small economy that nobody in the outside world could fully account for. They didn't farm in any traditional sense. They didn't sell timber. They didn't come to town for supplies more than 3 or 4 times a year, and when they did, they came in a group of 6 or 8. They paid in old silver coins, and they never spoke to anyone they didn't have to speak to, and yet they had money. Not just money to survive, but money to buy more land. Between 1,875 and 1,895, the Ghent family quietly purchased another 2,000 acres of land at the edges of their original property. Every purchase was made through an intermediary. Every purchase was paid for in cash or old coin, and every purchase expanded their territory in a way that made the hollow they controlled harder and harder for outsiders to approach. Where was the money coming from? The official theory, the one the state investigators would eventually settle on decades later, was moonshine. And there was moonshine. Nobody disputes that. The Ghents ran stills in the caves under their land, and they produced a whiskey that was, by all accounts, some of the finest corn liquor ever made in the state of Missouri. It sold for premium prices in Kansas City, in Memphis, in New Orleans. It was smuggled across state lines by a network of runners who knew never to ask where the whiskey came from and never to breathe the name Ghent in any city where a lawman might hear it. So yes, there was moonshine. But the moonshine alone doesn't explain everything. Because in 1889, a geologist from the University of Missouri was doing a survey of the region, and he made a discovery that never appeared in any published paper. He found traces of gold in the streams that ran off the Ghent property. Not enough to start a gold rush, but enough that a family working the seams quietly over decades could accumulate a fortune. The geologist wrote up his findings. He submitted them to the university, and then the report vanished. It was never published. It was never filed in the university archives. The geologist himself, a man named Harold Prescott, died 6 months later in what the coroner ruled a hunting accident. He was shot in the back of the head at close range with a weapon that was never recovered. Nobody in Taney County thought that was an accident. Now let's talk about the disappearances. Because between 1,891 and 1,934, at least 27 people are known to have vanished within a 5-mile radius of Mourning Fork. 27 that we can document. The real number is almost certainly higher, because in that part of the Ozarks, in that era, a lot of people came through and nobody kept a record. Peddlers, drifters, runaway labourers, fugitives from the law in 3 neighbouring states. If they walked into the wrong hollow and never walked out, who was going to notice? Who was going to file a report? Their families, if they had families, were hundreds of miles away and had no way of knowing where their son or brother or husband had disappeared to. The Ozarks were a place where people went to get lost, and the Ghents made sure a certain percentage of them stayed lost forever. The first documented disappearance was a young man named Samuel Kirby. He was 19 years old, the son of a schoolteacher from Springfield, and he was doing what a lot of young men in that era did. He was walking, just walking. He had a knapsack, a fishing pole, and enough money for a few weeks of food, and he was going to see the country before he settled down and took a job. He passed through the town of Forsyth on the afternoon of the 14th of June, 1891. The general store owner remembered him because he bought a can of peaches and asked for directions to the best fishing on the White River. The store owner pointed him east. Sam Kirby went west. Nobody knows why. He may have gotten his directions confused. He may have decided to explore. Whatever the reason, he ended up on the road that ran along the base of Mourning Fork. He was seen one more time by a woman named Ida Trask, who was hanging laundry outside her cabin. She said he waved at her and asked how far to the next town. She told him about 6 miles. He thanked her, kept walking, and disappeared around a bend in the road. That was the last confirmed sighting of Samuel Kirby. Before we move on to the private detective's investigation, stop for a second. What you just heard about Samuel Kirby and the road past Ida Trask's cabin is the part that changes everything, but it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the full account. The knapsack description, the uphill sound, it's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. His family searched for 2 years. They hired a private detective from Street Louis. They put notices in newspapers across 3 states. They offered a reward. Nothing. In the summer of 1893, the detective made his final report. He had traced Sam's route as far as Ida Trask's cabin. Beyond that, nothing. The detective wrote in his report that he had personally walked the road east of the Trask cabin for 4 miles in each direction. He had knocked on every door. He had spoken to every person who lived within sight of that road, and he had found exactly one person who might have seen something. An old man named Wilbur Coombs, who lived alone in a shack about 2 miles east of the Trask cabin. Wilbur told the detective that on the evening of the 14th of June, 1891, he had heard something on the road that he couldn't explain. He said it sounded like a young man calling out. He said the calling out went on for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, and it got fainter and fainter, and then it stopped. And he said the direction the sound was coming from was not the road. It was uphill. It was in the direction of Ghent land. The detective went back to his hotel that night and wrote all of this down. He did not, however, include it in his official report to the Kirby family. The reason he gave, in a private letter to a colleague, was that he had made inquiries in town about the Ghent family, and every person he asked had given him the same answer. Don't. Just don't. He wrote in the letter that he had spent 22 years as a detective in 3 different cities, and he had never encountered a group of people who inspired the kind of fear the Ghents inspired in the residents of Taney County. He wrote that he would rather chase a serial killer through the tenements of Street Louis than knock on the door of a Ghent cabin, and so he closed the case. And Sam Kirby was written down as missing, presumed drowned in the White River, and his family lit a candle for him every June 14th for the rest of their lives. Sam Kirby was the first. He was not the last. The second documented disappearance came less than a year later, in the spring of 1892. A woman named Eleanor Vance, a widow of 34, was traveling from her sister's farm in Christian County back to her home in Arkansas. She was driving a small wagon pulled by a single mule, and she was carrying with her the sum of $240 in cash, the proceeds from the sale of her late husband's land. Eleanor Vance was seen at a crossroads store about 6 miles north of Mourning Fork on the morning of April 3. She purchased a sack of flour, a wedge of cheese, and a tin of tobacco. She told the store owner she planned to reach the town of Yellville, Arkansas, by nightfall the following day. She did not reach Yellville. She did not reach any town. The mule was found 6 weeks later, wandering loose in a pasture near the base of the mountain, still wearing its harness. The wagon was found 2 days after the mule, upended in a ditch about 400 yards from the first switchback of the Ghent Trail. The wagon was empty. There was no sack of flour, there was no wedge of cheese, there was no tin of tobacco, and there was no $240 in cash. Eleanor Vance's sister rode down from Christian County to look for her. She spent a week walking the roads around Mourning Fork, knocking on doors, asking questions. She got the same answer everywhere. Nobody had seen anything, nobody knew anything, and nobody, it should be noted, would meet her eyes when they said it. She went home to her farm, wrote a letter to the sheriff, and never returned to Taney County. Eleanor Vance was 34 years old. She had 2 children back in Arkansas who never saw their mother again. The third disappearance was, in some ways, the most disturbing of the early cases. In August of 1894, a family of 4 was traveling through the region in a covered wagon. The father was a Methodist minister named Reverend Ephraim Halstead. His wife was a woman named Sarah. They had 2 young children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5. They were on their way from Illinois to a new congregation in northern Arkansas, and they had chosen a route through the Ozarks because Reverend Halstead had been told the scenery was beautiful and the roads were passable. They stopped at a farm about 2 miles from Mourning Fork on the evening of August 12 to ask for water and to camp for the night. The farmer let them draw water from his well. He offered to let them camp in his barn. Reverend Halstead thanked him, but said he preferred to camp a little farther down the road, near a creek he had spotted from the wagon. The farmer warned him. He specifically warned Reverend Halstead not to camp near that creek. He did not say why. He just said, "Don't." Reverend Halstead thanked him for the advice, and then he did what he wanted to do anyway. He drove the wagon another mile down the road and made camp near the creek. The creek ran off Ghent land. That was what the farmer had not told him, that the creek came out of the caves under the mountain. The Halstead family was never seen alive again. 2 years later, in 1896, a hunter working the edges of the state land found something in the woods about a half-mile from where the family had camped. He found a small leather-bound Bible. Inside the cover, in careful handwriting, was the inscription, "To Ephraim, on the occasion of your ordination, may God guide your path. Your loving mother, 1889. The hunter turned the Bible over to the county sheriff. The county sheriff filed it in a drawer. The drawer was cleaned out in 1954. The Bible was thrown away. Between 1891 and 1910, 16 more people disappeared within a 5-mile radius of Mourning Fork. Every one of them was traveling alone. Every one of them was last seen on a road that skirted Ghent land. And in every case, the investigation, if there was one, stopped at the base of the trail. The pattern was so consistent that by 1905, the Taney County Sheriff's Office had an unofficial policy. If a missing person report came in that involved travel through the Mourning Fork area, the file was marked with a small red dot in the upper corner. That red dot meant one thing. Don't investigate. Don't waste the manpower. Don't put a deputy at risk. Just file the paperwork, wait a year, and mark the case cold. The red dot policy was never written down. It was passed verbally from one sheriff to the next, but it existed for over 40 years. And a researcher who was allowed to examine the sealed Taney County archives in the early 2000s counted the red dots. There were 63 of them between 1891 and 1936. 63. Now here's where the story takes a turn that most people don't expect. Because the Ghents were not simply hiding on their mountain. They were not simply killing trespassers to protect their moonshine and their gold. They were, by the 1910s, running a much larger operation, and that operation involved people, specifically the buying and selling of people. This is the part of the Ghent story that the state of Missouri worked hardest to bury. This is the part that the sealed report contained, and this is the part that, once you understand it, makes everything else about the Ghent clan make a sickening kind of sense. The Ozarks in the early 20th century were full of what were then called hollow communities, isolated pockets of families, sometimes just one or two families, who lived so far off the main roads that they were essentially outside the reach of any government. Some of these hollow communities were harmless, just poor people trying to live poor lives away from the world. But some of them were not harmless. Some of them had built, over generations, a system of trade that operated entirely outside the law. They traded livestock, they traded moonshine, they traded stolen goods, and they traded people, runaway girls from the mill towns, orphan boys who had wandered too far from the orphanage, immigrants who had gotten off the train in the wrong station, anyone who could disappear without a search party being organized, anyone who could be turned into labor or into a wife or into something worse. The Ghents were at the center of this trade in southern Missouri. This is not speculation, this is documented, and to understand the scale of what was happening, you have to understand how the network operated. It worked in a series of what the trafficking historians now call way stations. A young woman would go missing from a town like Joplin, or Springfield, or Fayetteville, and she would be moved through a chain of isolated properties before she reached her final destination. The way stations were farms, or shacks, or abandoned mills, and they were spaced roughly a day's travel apart by wagon. Each way station was operated by a family that had, over the years, been brought into the network. Sometimes those families were paid in cash, sometimes they were paid in moonshine, sometimes they were paid in nothing more than the promise that if they did what they were told, the network would leave them alone. And that promise, in that time and place, was often payment enough, because everyone knew what happened to the families that refused. Everyone had heard the stories. The barn that burned down in the night, the son who went hunting and never came home, the message that arrived on the porch at dawn, tied to the neck of a dead dog. The way station network operated for at least 40 years, and the state of Missouri was, throughout that entire period, either unable or unwilling to shut it down. The Ghents were not the only family operating this network, but they were, by the accounts that have survived, the largest single node in it. The mountain at Mourning Fork was the final destination for a significant percentage of the people who entered the network in southern Missouri. It was also, according to the ledger, a redistribution point. People who arrived at Mourning Fork were not always kept there. Some of them were held for a few weeks and then sold on to other buyers. Some of them were sent farther south, into Arkansas, into Louisiana, into places where the state governments were even weaker and the isolated communities even more secretive. The Ghent ledger tracked all of this. It listed the names of the buyers, it listed the prices, it listed the dates of transfer, and when a researcher named Dr. Aaron Whitfield attempted, in 2004, to cross-reference the surviving fragments of the ledger against missing persons records from the surrounding states, he was able to confirm the identities of 47 separate individuals whose disappearances matched the ledger's entries. 47 confirmed, out of 134 names in the fragments. And the fragments represented, at most, perhaps a quarter of the full ledger. The true scale of what happened at Mourning Fork, over the span of 45 years, may never be fully known. In 1927, a federal agent named Thomas Reeves was investigating a case involving a young woman who had disappeared from a boarding house in Joplin. Her name was Ellen Marsh. She was 17 years old, and she had come to Joplin from Iowa looking for work. She was last seen getting into a wagon with two men she didn't know. The wagon was driven by a man who witnesses later identified as a distant Ghent cousin. Reeves traced the wagon's route south, through a series of hollows and back roads, and he came to the conclusion that Ellen Marsh had been delivered to Mourning Fork. He made this conclusion based on the accounts of 3 separate witnesses along the route who described seeing the wagon pass, describing a young woman inside it who appeared to be bound and gagged, and describing the direction the wagon was going. Agent Reeves went to his superiors in the Federal Bureau of Investigation. which is what the FBI was called at that time, and he requested a warrant to search the Ghent property. He was denied. The reason given in the official denial was insufficient evidence. The reason given in a private memo that surfaced decades later was different. The memo, written by the assistant director of the Bureau, said the following: "A raid on the Ghent property in Taney County, Missouri, would require a force of no fewer than 100 armed federal agents and would result in significant casualties on both sides. The Bureau is not prepared to undertake such an action at this time. Agent Reeves is instructed to close his investigation and pursue other leads." Agent Reeves did not close his investigation. Agent Reeves went to Mourning Fork by himself. He went in the winter of 1928, when the snow was deep and the trail was slick with ice. He carried a rifle, a sidearm, and a letter of instruction to his wife in case he did not return. He hiked up the trail alone. He made it past the first switchback. He made it past the second. Somewhere between the third and the fourth, something happened. Agent Reeves was found 7 weeks later, in the spring thaw at the base of the mountain. His body had been posed. His arms were folded across his chest. His federal badge had been placed on his forehead, and a piece of paper had been pinned to his coat. On the paper, in handwriting that a forensic expert later described as clumsy but deliberate, were the words, "Don't send another." The Bureau did not send another. The case of Ellen Marsh was closed. The case of Agent Thomas Reeves was ruled a hunting accident, and the memo about insufficient evidence was locked in a filing cabinet for the next 50 years. I want you to sit with that for a second. A federal agent, killed on that mountain, his badge placed on his forehead as a message. And the response of the United States government was to close the file, tell his widow he died in an accident, and never speak of it again. That is the kind of power the Ghent Clan held over the state of Missouri, and at least for that moment, over the federal government itself. The 1930s were when things finally started to change, not because the state of Missouri suddenly grew a spine, not because the federal government suddenly found the courage to raid the mountain. Things changed because the Ghents themselves started to fall apart. Every isolated family, given enough generations, runs into the same problem: genetics. The Ghents had been marrying their cousins for 80 years by the time the 1930s rolled around, and the results were beginning to show. A doctor from the town of Branson was called up to the mountain in 1931. This was an unusual event. The Ghents almost never allowed outsiders onto their land, but something had happened. A child had been born, and the child was not right, and the mother, a young Ghent woman, was bleeding to death. The doctor was a young man named Elias Pruitt, and he was, according to the account he later gave, taken up the mountain, blindfolded, held at gunpoint the entire time, and led into a cabin that stank so badly of blood and infection that he nearly vomited before he even saw the patient. What he saw in that cabin he refused to describe in detail for the rest of his life. He would only say that the mother did not survive, that the child did not survive, and that on his way back down the mountain, still blindfolded, still at gunpoint, he passed through a room in which he heard the sounds of what he believed to be at least a dozen people, none of whom spoke, all of whom were making noises that he described only as not right. Dr. Pruitt was paid for his visit. He was paid in old silver coins. He was told, very clearly, that if he ever spoke of what he saw, his own family would suffer for it. He kept his mouth shut for 40 years. It was only on his deathbed, in 1971, that he told the story to his son. His son wrote it down. His son's account is where most of the details we now have about the interior of the Ghent cabins come from. But the story of the doctor was just one crack in the wall. Because in 1933, a young Ghent man named Cyrus Ghent did something no Ghent had ever done. He left the mountain. He walked down the trail one night, walked to the town of Forsyth, and turned himself in at the sheriff's office. He said he wanted out. He said he could not live on that mountain anymore. He said if the sheriff would protect him, he would tell everything. The sheriff, a man named Wade Coleman, was in an impossible position. On the one hand, he had a Ghent in his custody, a Ghent who was willing to talk. This was a moment 40 years in the making. On the other hand, he had a Ghent in his custody, which meant the rest of the Ghent clan was going to come looking. Sheriff Coleman locked Cyrus in the back cell, wired the state capital for instructions, and waited. The instructions came back the next morning. Move Cyrus Ghent to Street Louis immediately. Do not tell anyone. Do not stop for anything. The state would take it from there. Sheriff Coleman put Cyrus in the back of a car at 3 in the morning and started driving north. He never made it to Street Louis. Somewhere on a stretch of road outside the town of Rolla, the car was ambushed. Sheriff Coleman was shot 4 times and killed. His deputy, who was driving, was shot twice but survived, and Cyrus Ghent was taken from the back of the car and driven away in a wagon that came out of the woods. The wagon was never traced. Cyrus Ghent was never seen again. Not in Missouri, not anywhere. The most likely explanation, and the one the state investigators eventually settled on, was that Cyrus was taken back to Mourning Fork and executed by his own family. As a warning to any other Ghent who might consider leaving, it worked. No Ghent ever left again, not voluntarily. But the state of Missouri had reached its breaking point. A sheriff had been murdered, a federal agent had been murdered, a doctor had been terrorized, 63 people had disappeared, and the Ghents, deep in their hollow, seemed to think they were untouchable. The governor of Missouri at the time was a man named Guy Park. He was not, by most accounts, a particularly brave man, but he was a proud man, and the killing of Sheriff Coleman on a public road, in front of witnesses, was too much for his pride to absorb. In the fall of 1934, Governor Park did something that no Missouri governor had ever done. He authorized the mobilization of the state militia, not the National Guard, the militia, a force of over 300 armed men drawn from the state's regular military reserves, with orders to move on Mourning Fork and end the Ghent Clan once and for all. The operation was called Operation Mountain Clean. It was launched on the 14th of October 1934. And what happened over the next 6 days is, even by the standards of Ozark history, one of the darkest and most heavily suppressed episodes in the state's past. The militia moved into position under cover of darkness. They surrounded the entire Ghent property, cutting off every possible escape route. They positioned snipers on the ridges above the cabins. They brought in a piece of light artillery, a small howitzer, and they set it up in a clearing about 800 yards from the main Ghent compound. At dawn on October 15, a militia officer with a bullhorn walked to the base of the trail and demanded the surrender of every person on the Ghent property. He gave them 1 hour to come down the trail with their hands up. The response from the mountain was silence. Not a single Ghent came down. Not a single voice called back. The officer waited the full hour, then he gave the order. The howitzer fired first. But before I describe what happened next, you need to understand who these militia soldiers were. They were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, mechanics, factory workers, veterans of the First World War who had been called up out of the reserves and given 3 days of refresher training before being sent into the mountains. They were, most of them, men from other parts of the state who had never heard of the Ghent Clan. They had been told, by their officers, that they were being sent to arrest a family of moonshiners and criminals who had killed a sheriff. That was all they knew when they took their positions on the ridges above Mourning Fork. They did not know what was in the caves. They did not know what was in the cabins. They did not know that they were about to become the first outsiders in nearly 90 years to set foot on the top of that mountain, and they did not know that a significant number of them were not coming back down. The first shell hit the roof of the main cabin. The second hit the barn. The third hit the smokehouse. The Ghents returned fire from positions in the trees and from the mouths of the caves, and for the next 2 days a full-scale battle was fought on the slopes of Mourning Fork. The militia lost 22 men. The Ghents lost, by the militia's own count, at least 40. But the militia had numbers, they had artillery, and they had time. By the evening of October 17, the resistance from the mountain had gone silent. The militia moved in. What they found on top of that mountain is the reason the report was sealed. The cabins, the ones still standing, were full of people, not fighters. Not the armed Ghent men who had defended the mountain. Those were mostly dead. What was left were the women, the children, and the ones the doctor had heard 40 years later making noises he could not describe. The militia found people who had never left the mountain in their lives, people who had been born on that land, grown up on that land, and lived their entire existence within the boundaries of Ghent property. Some of them could not speak. Some of them did not understand what was happening. Some of them attacked the militia soldiers with knives and had to be subdued. And some of them, and this is what the report described in language that later investigators found difficult to read, were not fully human anymore in the ways that mattered. They had been kept in conditions that no living person should ever be kept in. They had been fed things no person should ever be fed. And they had been used, for decades, in ways that the report described only through euphemism, because the men writing the report could not bring themselves to write it plainly. The militia also found the rooms that had no doors, rooms that had been sealed from the outside for what forensic examination later determined was, in some cases, over a decade. When those rooms were opened, the militia found the remains of people who had been walled in alive. Some of the remains were old, reduced to bone and dust. Some of the remains were more recent. The state pathologist who examined the recovered remains later wrote in his report that he was unable to determine the exact cause of death in most cases because the conditions inside the rooms had been so severe. Starvation, dehydration, exposure, any number of things. What he was able to determine was that the people sealed in those rooms had not died quickly. There were marks on the walls, marks that indicated fingers had scraped at the wood for a very long time. The pathologist requested reassignment after completing his report. He never worked another case for the state of Missouri. The militia also found the cages. There were 7 of them, built into the walls of the largest cave under the property. Each cage was large enough to hold 1 adult. Each cage had been in continuous use, based on the wear on the bars and the accumulated filth on the floors, for a period of at least 30 years. The militia found 3 people alive in the cages, 2 women and 1 man. None of them was a Ghent. All of them had been reported missing, from various towns in Missouri and Arkansas, between 1,919 and 1,932. All 3 were taken off the mountain alive. Only 1 of them survived the first year afterward. The 3 prisoners who came off the mountain alive deserve their own place in this story, because their fates, in the years that followed, tell you something important about what the Ghent Clan had done to human beings. The first survivor was a woman named Prudence Kelso. She had been reported missing from a mill town in Arkansas in 1919. She was 17 when she disappeared. She was 32 when she came off Mourning Fork. She had spent 15 years in one of those cages. When the state doctors examined her, they found she could no longer walk without assistance. Her legs had atrophied. Her vision was severely damaged from years in near-total darkness. She could speak, but only in short phrases, and she used only about 40 words. She was placed in a state hospital in Nevada, Missouri. She died there in the spring of 1935, 6 months after being freed. The cause of death was listed as heart failure. The nurses who cared for her said she stopped eating in her final weeks. They said she would not tell them why. They said she seemed, at the end, to want to go. The second survivor was a woman named Hannah Bell. She had been missing from a farm in the Missouri Bootheel since 1927. She had spent 7 years in Ghent captivity. She was returned to her family, who had, remarkably, never given up hope of finding her. She lived with her parents for the rest of her life. She never married. She never spoke, to her family or to anyone else, about what had happened to her on the mountain. She wrote things down sometimes, in a notebook she kept locked in a drawer beside her bed, but she never let anyone read the notebook. When she died in 1978, her family found the notebook and, following the instructions she had left in her will, burned it without reading it. Whatever Hannah Bell knew, whatever she had witnessed, whatever had been done to her, she carried with her to the grave. Her surviving relatives will only say that she was a kind woman, that she loved animals, and that she was afraid, all the way to the end of her life, of the sound of footsteps outside her bedroom door at night. The third survivor was the man. His name, as best the investigators could determine, was Wallace Prine. He had gone missing from a lumber camp in Oklahoma in 1932. He was only 26 years old when the militia broke open his cage. Wallace Prine did not survive his first year off the mountain. He was placed in the same state hospital as Prudence Kelso, but unlike Prudence, Wallace did not go quietly. Wallace attacked the hospital staff on multiple occasions. He attempted to escape 3 times, and in the summer of 1935 he succeeded. He walked out of the hospital in the middle of the night, wearing only a hospital gown, and he disappeared into the countryside. The state searched for him for 6 weeks. They did not find him. His body was discovered, purely by chance, the following spring by a fisherman on a creek about 70 miles east of Mourning Fork. Wallace Prine had been walking, on foot, in a straight line, toward the mountain. He had not made it. He had died somewhere along the way. Whether he was trying to go back, or whether he was trying to warn someone, or whether some part of his mind had simply stopped working after everything he had been through, no one will ever know. 3 survivors. 3 people who came off that mountain alive. And within 18 months, all 3 of them were dead. That is what the Ghent Clan did to human beings. That is the mark it left. And that is what the state of Missouri decided the public was not permitted to know. The militia found the ledger. This is the piece of evidence that, more than anything else, forced the state of Missouri to seal the entire investigation. In a locked chest under the floorboards of the main cabin, they found a leather-bound book. Inside the book, in careful handwriting that spanned 4 different generations of Ghent authors, was a record of every person the Ghents had taken, a record of every transaction, a record of names, dates, prices paid, and prices received. The ledger went back to 1889. It ran for over 300 pages, and by the time the state investigators finished analyzing it, they had identified the fates of 134 missing people across a span of 45 years. Some of those people had been sold to other hollow communities. Some of them had been kept on the mountain until they died. Some of them, according to the notations in the ledger, had been consumed. That is the word the ledger used. Consumed. The report of Operation Mountain Clean was completed in the spring of 1935. It ran to over 400 pages. It included photographs. It included transcripts of interviews with the surviving militia members and the surviving prisoners. It included a full transcription of the Ghent ledger. And it was, by the order of the governor and the state attorney general, sealed for a period of 75 years. The reasoning given was that public knowledge of the report's contents would cause panic across the state, would damage the reputation of the Ozarks region for a generation, and would potentially inspire copycat crimes in other isolated communities. The report was locked in a vault in the state capital. The vault was, according to state records, opened exactly once in the following 75 years, in 1962, when a new governor requested a summary. The summary was provided verbally. The governor asked no follow-up questions. The vault was locked again. In 2010, 75 years after the sealing, the report was scheduled for release. It was not released. According to a statement from the Missouri State Archives, the report was discovered to be missing during the preparation for its declassification. An internal investigation was launched. The internal investigation concluded that the report had been misfiled at some point in the previous decades and could not be located. No further explanation was given. No further investigation was conducted. The report of Operation Mountain Clean, one of the most significant law enforcement documents in the history of the state of Missouri, simply vanished. And with it vanished the only official record of what actually happened on Mourning Fork. But not everything vanished, because in the years since 2010, researchers have found fragments. A photograph in a private collection that appears to show the interior of one of the cages. A page from the ledger that was, at some point, photocopied and preserved by an unknown state employee. Interviews with the descendants of militia soldiers, some of whom had spoken about what they saw before they died. And the notes of Dr. Pruitt's son and of Dr. Margaret Hollis and of a handful of other researchers who have spent their careers trying to reconstruct what the state of Missouri worked so hard to bury. From those fragments, this is what we know for certain. The Ghent Clan of Mourning Fork was not a family of hillbillies. It was not a group of moonshiners who got mean. It was, over the course of nearly 90 years, one of the most organized, most successful, and most protected criminal enterprises in the history of the American South. It ran on gold and moonshine on the surface. It ran on the trafficking and destruction of human beings underneath. It survived because it terrorized an entire region into silence. And it ended, finally, only when the state of Missouri decided that ending it was cheaper than letting it continue. The mountain itself is still there. The land is now part of a state conservation area. The trail is officially closed to the public, though a determined hiker can find the old switchbacks if they know where to look. The cabins are gone. The howitzer knocked most of them down, and the militia burned what was left before they came off the mountain. The caves are still there, and they are still, according to state geological surveys, extensive and mostly unexplored. In 1978, a group of college students from the University of Missouri attempted to explore the main cave system as a class project. They were turned back by state officials at the base of the mountain. The official reason given was safety concerns due to unstable rock formations. The students were told the caves would be surveyed and mapped by the state at some future date. That survey has never been conducted. The caves under Mourning Fork have never been officially explored. What is down there, and what may still be down there, is a question the state of Missouri has, for almost 100 years now, chosen not to ask. The Ghent bloodline itself is another question. The official position of the state is that every Ghent on the mountain either died in the battle or died in the years immediately afterward. The last documented Ghent, an old woman named Ada Ghent, who had been captured during Operation Mountain Clean, died in a state institution in 1949. She was, according to her medical records, mentally impaired to a degree that made communication with her nearly impossible. She never spoke a full sentence during her 14 years in state custody. She died of pneumonia. She was buried in an unmarked grave, and with her, officially, the Ghent line ended. Unofficially, the story is different, because the ledger, the parts of it that survived, indicated something the state investigators were reluctant to publicize. The Ghents had not stayed on the mountain the entire time. Over the decades, they had, quietly, sent members of their family out into the world. Young Ghents, mostly women, who were sent to marry into other families in other states, under other names. Some of them went to Arkansas, some of them went to Oklahoma. Some of them went as far as Texas and Louisiana. The purpose of this dispersal, based on the ledger's own notes, was insurance, in case the mountain was ever taken, in case the family was ever destroyed. There would be Ghent blood and Ghent knowledge and Ghent connections scattered across the south, waiting. Waiting for what? The ledger did not say. But it hinted, in one of the last pages that survived, in handwriting that appeared to belong to one of the younger Ghents, there was a passage that read as follows: "We are not the end of the line. We are the guardians of the line. What Elias began, we carry. What we carry, our cousins in the low country will finish. The mountain sleeps, but the mountain does not die. When the time comes, we will wake it again." That passage was written based on the ink and paper analysis conducted decades later, sometime in the early 1930s. It was written by a Ghent who knew, or suspected, that Operation Mountain Clean was coming. And it was written as a message, not to the state investigators who would eventually find it, to whoever was left, to whoever was still out there. Dr. Aaron Whitfield, the researcher who cross-referenced the ledger against missing persons records, spent the last decade of his career trying to identify the cousins in the low country that the passage referenced. He believed, based on the ledger's marriage records, that at least 6 young Ghent women had been sent south between 1905 and 1925. He believed they had married into families in 3 specific parishes in Louisiana. He believed their descendants were still alive today, and he believed that those descendants might be aware, in some form, of what their ancestors had been part of. Dr. Whitfield died in 2019 before he could complete his research. His notes were donated to the University of Missouri, where they are, at this moment, sealed to the public. The reason given for the seal was that the notes contained personal identifying information about living private citizens. That may be true. It may also be that the University of Missouri, like the state of Missouri before it, has decided that some things are better left in a locked drawer. But the researchers who have studied the ledger have noted something curious. In the decades since Operation Mountain Clean, a small number of isolated communities across the American South have exhibited patterns that echo, in disturbing ways, the patterns of the Ghent Clan. Communities that keep to themselves. Communities that pay for land in old silver coin. Communities where outsiders are unwelcome and disappearances go unreported. Communities where the local sheriff has a policy, unwritten but understood, of not sending deputies past a certain road. These communities are scattered from the Arkansas Ozarks to the Louisiana Bayou to the piney woods of East Texas. Nobody has proven any connection between them. Nobody has proven that they are anything more than the ordinary isolated communities that have always existed in the poorer parts of the American South. But the researchers who have studied the Ghent ledger have their suspicions, and when you press them on it, they will tell you, quietly, that they believe the Ghent Clan did not end on that mountain in 1934. They believe the Ghent Clan simply went underground. They believe the Ghent Clan is still out there. And they believe the day may come when the Ghents decide it is time to come home to Mourning Fork. Some of the people who live in the towns around Mourning Fork believe that day has already come. They will tell you, if you catch them alone, that in the last 20 years there has been an increase in strange occurrences in the woods around the old Ghent property. Lights seen at night in areas where no lights should be. Sounds heard in the caves. Livestock disappearing from farms at the base of the mountain in patterns that echo the patterns of 100 years ago. In 2016, a hiker vanished on a marked trail 3 miles from the old Ghent land. His name was Kevin Brelin. He was 29 years old, an experienced backpacker who had hiked in the Rockies and the Sierra Nevada and the White Mountains of New Hampshire. He came to the Missouri Ozarks for what he described in a text message to his sister as a nice, easy weekend trip. He had planned a 2-day loop that would keep him well within marked and maintained trails. He parked his truck at a designated trailhead on a Friday afternoon. He sent a text to his sister at 4 p.m. saying he had reached his first campsite. That text was the last communication anyone had with him. When he did not return home on Sunday evening, his sister called the State Park Service. A search was launched on Monday morning. The search ran for 11 days. It involved over 40 personnel, 3 helicopters, 4 dog teams, and a coordinated grid pattern that covered every marked trail and every plausible off-trail route within a 15-mile radius of his last known campsite. They found nothing. They did not find his tent. They did not find his backpack. They did not find any trace of him. The search was suspended after 11 days and never officially reopened. His body has never been found. The state ranger who led the search was a woman named Diane Torvik. She retired the following year and moved to Colorado. She does not answer questions about the case. When contacted by a journalist in 2020, she would only say one sentence. She said, "We were looking in the wrong direction, and I knew it, and there was nothing I could do about it." She refused to explain what she meant by that. In 2019, a farmer in a nearby hollow reported that his best cow had gone missing. 3 days later, he found the cow's head on his porch. The eyes had been removed, the tongue had been removed, and a symbol had been carved into the forehead. The farmer described the symbol to a local reporter as looking like a spider with too many legs, or maybe a hand with too many fingers. He couldn't tell which. The symbol itself has become the subject of a small and largely ignored branch of folklore studies. A researcher at the University of Arkansas, a folklorist named Dr. Rebecca Klein, spent nearly 6 years attempting to trace the origin of what she calls the Mourning Fork mark. She collected over 30 different eyewitness descriptions of the symbol from accounts spanning more than 100 years. She commissioned drawings from every witness who was still alive, and when she overlaid those drawings on top of one another, she found something that she was, by her own admission, not prepared for. The symbol was not, as most people had assumed, a stylized spider or a hand with too many fingers. It was a map, or more precisely, it was a diagram. The lines corresponded, almost exactly, to the layout of the cave system underneath Mourning Fork, as it had been partially mapped by the geologist Harold Prescott shortly before his death in 1889. The symbol carved into the heads of the mutilated animals was, and had been for over 100 years, a warning that specifically referenced the caves. A warning that said, in effect, this is where you will end up. This is what is waiting for you underneath the mountain. Dr. Klein published her findings in a small academic journal in 2018. Her paper received almost no attention. She was denied tenure at her university the following year. She now teaches at a community college in a state she has asked not to be identified. She has told researchers who have contacted her that she believes she was denied tenure specifically because of her work on the Ghent symbol. She has also told those researchers, on the record, that she believes the symbol is still in active use, that someone, somewhere in the Ozarks, is still carving that mark into the heads of animals and leaving them on the porches of people who need to be warned. And she has said, quite plainly, that she does not know who is doing it, and she does not want to know. That reporter's article was never published. The reporter herself left the industry 6 months later and now works in a different state. When contacted by researchers for this story, she declined to comment. She would only say, off the record, that she wished she had never taken the assignment, and that she hoped, for the sake of everyone in Taney County, that the story was wrong. She hoped the Ghents were gone, but she was not sure. The mountain is still there. The caves are still there. The state of Missouri still keeps the trail officially closed. And every year, on the anniversary of Operation Mountain Clean, a small group of people gather at the base of Mourning Fork. They do not go up. They stand at the foot of the trail, and they look up at the ridge, and they wait. They wait for the sun to go down. They wait for the wind to shift. And then they light candles for the 63 people whose names were marked with a red dot in the Taney County archives. The 63 people who walked past that mountain and never came home. Nobody who attends the gathering ever climbs the trail. Nobody who attends the gathering ever will. The gathering itself is not organized by any group or church or civic association. It has no leader. It has no name. It happens because it has always happened, since the year after Operation Mountain Clean, when a handful of family members of the disappeared came to the base of the mountain to mourn people they had never been allowed to bury. Their children continued the tradition. Their grandchildren continued it. And today, nearly 90 years later, a small group of strangers still gathers each October at the foot of a trail the state of Missouri says does not exist, to remember people whose names appear in no cemetery, whose bodies were never recovered, and whose deaths were, in the official records, never recorded at all. There is no marker at the base of the trail. There is no monument. There is only a small pile of stones that has grown a little larger every year, as each attendee places one stone before they leave. The pile is now, according to the last person who counted them, made up of more than 400 stones. One stone for each candle lit, one stone for each name whispered into the wind at the base of the trail. And every year, without fail, someone adds a new stone that no one at the gathering can account for. Because the rule that Elias Ghent laid down in 1847, the rule that Sheriff Buford Kane accepted after 2 hours in the Ghent cabin, the rule that killed Agent Thomas Reeves and Sheriff Wade Coleman and 134 people, whose names filled the pages of that ledger, that rule is still in effect. It was never repealed. It was never overturned. The state of Missouri may have taken the mountain by force in 1934, but the mountain, and whatever is under it, has never fully belonged to the state again. If you drive through Taney County today, you will not see any sign of Mourning Fork on the map. The name was removed from the official maps in 1936, 1 year after the report was sealed. The area is now labelled on state topographical maps simply as Conservation Area 4B. Nobody in the local government will tell you why the name was removed. Nobody in the state archives will tell you either. The name Mourning Fork does not appear in any state document produced after 1936. But if you stop at a gas station in Forsyth, or a diner in Branson, or a general store in any of the small towns that ring the old Ghent land, and you ask an old-timer where Mourning Fork is, they will know. They will point up toward the ridge. They will tell you the trail starts behind an old barn about 4 miles east of town. And they will tell you, before you leave, do not go up there. Not alone. Not in a group. Not ever. And if you ask them why, they will give you the same answer their grandparents gave, and their great-grandparents before them. Because the Ghents may be gone. But the mountain remembers. And the mountain is patient. It has waited 80 years for the story to be told. It can wait 80 more for the story to end. That's the story of the Ghent Clan of Mourning Fork. The story the state tried to erase, the report that vanished from a locked vault, and the family whose bloodline may still be walking among us in towns and cities across the South. If this video kept you watching all the way to the end, do me a favor, hit the subscribe button right now, because next week I'm breaking down another one of these buried Ozark stories, and this next one involves a hollow in Arkansas where 3 separate law enforcement agencies have refused to enter since 1971. You do not want to miss it. The video is on your screen. Click it right now and leave a comment while you're at it. Tell me what you would have done if you were the sheriff at the base of that trail in 1934. Tell me if you would have gone up, or tell me you would have turned around and gone home. Either answer is honest. Only one of them keeps you alive.